Hey, I'm Jenna. I am Jenna's Plants on Instagram, and I wanted to take a minute today and just talk about how I failed, specifically how I failed with my self-watering pots. So about, I don't know, it was a few months ago, I repotted all of my Hoya into self-watering pots. Now, I did a video on self-watering pots, which I don't really recommend you go and watch. I was still getting a lot of things figured out with my sound at that point, so I don't think the audio is very good. It's probably super cringe, so don't watch it. I'll try and recap the main points here. But anyways, I ended up repotting all of my Hoyas into self-watering pots. So I want to show you how and why some of my Hoyas look like this. Seriously, like, look at that. And why some of my Hoyas look like this. So first thing, if I hold these up, you might not be able to tell, but these are actually two different substrates. So for both of these, they're in a pond-like mixture. They're both made by small businesses in Ontario. This one is called Jeffrey's Hoya Mix. This one is Crystal Star Nursery's Soilless Mix. Both of these substrates are very good in their own right. The Jeffrey's Hoya Mix, it retains just a little bit more moisture than pond does. It has orchid bark, I believe, zeolite and lava rock, I think. Don't quote me on that. It holds a little bit more moisture than pond. So before I moved my Hoyas to self-watering pots, I had them just in this substrate, and most of them were doing absolutely phenomenal. So this is my preferred substrate out of self-watering because it holds moisture just a little bit better, a little bit longer than pond does. Now, in self-watering, unfortunately, what I found is that it keeps things a little bit too wet. And because it has orchid bark pieces, they do break down all the time. They are organic. So that also plays a role in basically it getting more compact and more sludgy at the bottom over time. So unfortunately, this one didn't make it. Now, if I pull out these, if I can pull this root system out, you'll probably be able to see how unhealthy it is. Oh, I don't want to make a huge mess, but if you see really stringy roots, that's likely a sign that they are completely rotten. Those ones are, yeah, not in good shape. And don't worry, by the way, I didn't kill this plant. I noticed that it wasn't really growing for a long time, so I took a bunch of cuttings, so it'll be fine. It's just these ones are pretty much gone. It might be hard to tell, but they are like wrinkly, and you can tell some of them have dried up. Now, I have to say, because my plants were growing in this mix before and I didn't want to disturb them, some of them, including some of my more pricey Hoyas, I did just keep in this mix, and they've been doing absolutely fine. Like this Hoya Nova Ghost has just been growing and hasn't skipped a beat. Now, this is a Carnosa variety, so Carnosas tend to be a little bit more hardy and less fussy. So that might be a contributing factor as to why it's still doing really, really well, even though it's in this substrate that on average of the Hoyas that have rotted, I maybe have only had one that has rotted in the soilless mix from Crystal Star, but I've had a lot more in this mix that holds slightly more moisture. Now, this mix from Crystal Star Nursery, the pieces are actually, you might be able to see a little bit better. I'm experimenting with one of my anthuriums now in this mix as well, but that's for another day. So the pieces are a little bit chunkier than they are with pond. So I find it retains like a little bit less, maybe not a little bit less, but the pieces are a little bit chunkier than they are with pond. But you can see it's still wicking up the water really nicely. That's what I like about this mix versus Leca. I find Leca is like too big. So I find that you get this like line where at the bottom it's wet and at the top it's dry. And I really don't like that. I feel like for the roots to get the best benefit, you kind of want it to be a relatively consistent moisture level all the way through. So you can see with this stuff that it is like moist just below the surface, which is what I like. But all the materials in it are inorganic, so I can't remember what's all in this one, but it's clay, zeolite, charcoal, pumice, I think, lava rock. So lots of very porous, aerating, inorganic materials. Now, because of the size of the particles, they don't compact, which allows for a lot of oxygen in the root zone. And also, because there's no organic component, it means that it doesn't break down. So one of the problems I had with the other mix, it had orchid bark pieces in it that I think start to decompose over time. And unfortunately, that impacts the aeration of that mix, and it can also throw off things like pH and all that stuff. So this has been the best mix for my self-watering pots. If you can't get this, I know a lot of people use Pon or they use Leca, maybe like a small Leca would be more equivalent to this. But this has been a game changer when it comes to my self-watering pots. Most of my Hoyas have just done absolutely phenomenal in it. Just touching on it, look, you can actually see this nice root like growing right in here. So far promising results for aerites too, which I'm very happy with. Just to touch very quickly on oxygenation, that is the most important thing for your root zone. And one of the things you're gonna find challenging in a self-watering setup, that's the main reason why your roots rot, is because they're not getting enough oxygen. So using something really aerating, something that doesn't compact even when it is constantly moist, that is like super important, because those roots getting oxygen, once they run out of oxygen, you're gonna have rot and you're gonna have problems. So the second mistake that I made, I was super aggressive when I was getting old substrate off and getting old dead roots off. Now, the reason I was so aggressive was because I was struggling with root mealies on a lot of my Hoyas. Basically, I banged off all the old substrate, tore off any of the roots that were not looking healthy, and I washed the roots and then I soaked them in a bath of insecticidal soap and a bit of pesticide. So that is a good treatment for root mealies, but it's really bad for the roots. And if you're really aggressive with the roots when you're repotting, that can be a problem, because even if you have healthy roots, once they get broken, they're going to die. So once you have healthy roots that break, they're gonna start rotting in your substrate, and that rot can spread and do a chain reaction, and then you lose basically all the roots. So what I should have done instead were any of the Hoyas that maybe had unhealthy looking roots, or I was concerned about root mealies, what I should have done is I should have just taken cuttings, probably rooted them in water or rooted them in the soilless mix that I was potting them up in later. That would have been way better to transition them. When Hoya roots become unhealthy and the stem where they're connected to becomes unhealthy, they don't necessarily regrow out of there anyways. So you're often better off just taking cuttings and basically restarting the plant. They'll often do way better, and they'll actually grow faster than the previous plant would anyways. Now, if you're in a position where you're repotting from something like sphagnum moss into self-watering, you want to be getting as much off as possible. So again, I'm more aggressive with the roots. Usually, I don't worry about preserving all of the little roots. I try to just make sure that there are some. As long as there are some main healthy roots, they will usually re-root pretty quickly into a self-watering setup. So as long as you have some healthy roots, I don't worry about it too much. I think you're better off when you're moving into self-watering getting more of the moss off, because obviously the moss is going to be a sponge that soaks up a lot of water, and in a self-watering setup, that can lead to rot more quickly. So I would lean towards getting rid of more substrate, damaging more roots, but then often once you pot them up, the roots will recover and they'll regrow and everything will be fine. Occasionally they don't, the roots just decide to die, but unfortunately Hoyas are kind of I don't know, sometimes they decide to just do that anyways, or they decide to get stem rot just randomly, and that can happen basically anytime you repot because it's going to be stressful on them, and if they get the wrong bacteria in there anyways, it's something that can always happen. So you kind of just have to be keeping an eye on your Hoyas after you repot them, and if you get things like sudden leaf drop, the leaves are turning mushy and yellow, you got to take cuttings right away at that point because it means that the stem has started to rot and the plant will be dead pretty soon if you don't do anything about it. But that should be a pretty rare occurrence. Now, the third thing that I did wrong, so I applied a mycorrhizal inoculant powder to the roots. Now, mycorrhizae is a beneficial I think it's fungal, like it's a beneficial fungus that forms a symbiotic relationship with the roots, and it basically allows your roots to extract more nutrients from the substrate. That's my understanding of it. So this is a good thing. What I did wrong is I applied like way too much of it. I really just like loaded it on the roots. And if you're applying like a powder, what it's going to do is it's kind of going to fill up those spaces in between the substrate where the air pockets would be. So you're displacing the oxygen, right? So I think that's what unfortunately led to rot on some of mine. Now, I would still recommend using a mycorrhizal inoculant, but I think for self-watering, I would recommend finding a version that you can add to your water. So then you just add it to the water and it will make contact and get to the roots that way. I think that is how I will be doing it in the future, but lesson learned. Now, you might think that I would have rot for leaving my roots sitting in the reservoir like this, but that actually hasn't been the case. And the reason why that is, so roots can live in water quite happily. You get problems when the water starts to run out of oxygen, which happens, pretty quickly with a small reservoir. I do a few things. So for my Hoyas anyways, I try and let the reservoir run completely dry between refilling the reservoir. If it's not completely dry before I refill the reservoir, then when I'm not lazy, I will dump the old water out, and that just makes sure you're replenishing the reservoir with oxygenated water every time. What you don't want is a pool of stagnant water that leads to anaerobic bacteria growth, and those are the bad kind of bacteria that can end up killing the roots. But as long as there's oxygen in the water, then the roots should be fine. This is when I actually put mesh in the bottom to try and prevent the roots from growing in, but what they've done is they've actually grown right through the wicking cord, which is like kind of funny. It'll be fun to try and repot, I'm sure. This is one of the worst ones. They're not all that bad, but you can see all the growth up top. You also want to make sure you're not overfilling the reservoir, because these reservoirs, they're designed to be at a certain level where they're not actually into the main substrate zone. Once they get into the substrate zone, they're going to displace any air pockets you have in that substrate. And again, that's what can lead to anaerobic environment and root rot once the water runs out of oxygen. By not overfilling the reservoir, you're not going to push out the oxygen that's in your substrate, and what you'll end up getting is like a little layer of air between the water reservoir and the substrate. So that is also a space where you have basically a big air pocket where the roots can get oxygen from as they need. So I actually have not had any issues with roots rotting in the reservoir as long as I'm changing it out regularly. So that's a myth, I guess, of what maybe would cause root rot in a self-watering setup. Nothing wrong with the roots growing into the reservoir on their own. You just don't want to like leave the reservoir stagnant for a long time because that will lead to rot. So there you go. That's a quick update of why some of my self-watering pots utterly failed. But overall, using self-watering pots has been honestly a total game changer for my hoyas. I will link these ones that I use in the description. I'm experimenting now because it's gone so well for my hoyas with some of my aeroids, so I will do an update on how that goes. It definitely takes a lot less energy to care for them because I can just fill up all the reservoirs at one time and they last longer. I haven't had as many issues with rot, and yeah, all my hoyas are just exploding with growth right now. So I definitely recommend self-watering pots, especially if you're like me and you have a really hard time telling when your hoyas need watered. If you are maybe a little neglectful and let them go like, 3 weeks without water or something, because the other problem with hoyas is they actually need to be watered pretty frequently. They like to dry out in between, but most of them do actually like a fair bit of water. If they stay dry for too long in between the times that you water, the roots will dry up and then you get dry rot. So the next time you do water, the roots that have desiccated will rot basically, and then you can get other problems like stem rot and whatever. So I've experienced all of that with my hoyas. Long story short, they're doing way, way, way better in self-watering. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. Thanks so much for your time watching this video. A special thank you if you watched my plant tour video and you left a comment saying that you wanted to see this video. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope you have an awesome day and I'll see you in the next video.